The night sky sprawled endlessly above the quiet neighborhood, stars like tiny pinpricks in a vast blanket of darkness. Inside, Michael sat in his dimly lit office, fingers tapping a slow, erratic rhythm against his desk. He rubbed his temples, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The day's grind had worn him down, but he comforted himself with the thought that all his hard work was for his family. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. "Another night, another sacrifice," he murmured, lifting a mug of coffee to his lips. The taste was bitter and stale, but he drank it anyway, hoping for a spark of energy. As he leaned back in his chair, a muffled voice slipped through the slightly open door. He froze, tilting his head. It was Ashley. Her voice was low but urgent. "Yes, Mother," she whispered sharply, with a tone colder than he'd ever heard. Michael leaned forward, his heart racing. Rising slowly, he moved quietly toward the door, stopping just out of sight and holding his breath, straining to catch every word. "Of course, Peter's the father of all 6 kids," Ashley continued, irritation evident in her voice. "That fool thinks they're his. Every time I told him I was expecting, he signed over another property. It was almost too easy." She laughed, a sound that twisted Michael's stomach. His blood ran cold, and the mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He didn't even flinch, the weight of her words hitting him like a freight train. His mind whirled, struggling to process what he was hearing, as if the ground had vanished from beneath him. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. Ashley didn't seem to notice the noise. She continued speaking, each word driving another nail into the coffin of their marriage. "Once the youngest finishes school, everything will be in my name," she stated casually. "Then I'll divorce him. Peter and I can finally have the life we deserve." Michael felt bile rise in his throat. He wanted to burst in, scream, and demand answers, but he held back, forcing himself to remain silent. He needed to know everything. He clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. "Don't worry, Mother," Ashley said, her tone softening to something almost soothing. "By then Michael will be on the streets. It's all arranged." Michael's chest heaved as waves of anger, humiliation, and heartbreak washed over him. He backed away, unable to listen any further. Each step felt heavy, as though he were trudging through quicksand. He returned to his office, closed the door softly, and slumped into his chair. Staring into the distance, the room was deathly quiet. Only the faint ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Every memory he had of Ashley played through his mind like a cruel montage. Their wedding, the births of their children, the late nights comforting each other, all of it was a lie. "Peter," he whispered, the name coming out like a curse. Rising abruptly, he knocked his chair over. The crash echoed through the room, but he hardly noticed. His mind was a chaotic storm, each thought more disordered than the last. He paced, his fists clenching and unclenching, until he forced himself to stop. This wasn't the time for anger. He needed to think, to form a plan. His hands shook as he sank into the chair, burying his face in his palms. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of the betrayal, the heartbreak, the humiliation. Then he sat up, wiping his eyes. "Enough," he muttered. "She won't win." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, documents, and planning. He worked with cold efficiency, channeling his fury into action. By dawn, every property was back in his name. But there was one more thing to do. He picked up the phone again, dialing a private investigator. When the man answered, Michael didn't waste time. "I need DNA tests for my children," he said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Of course," the investigator replied. "When would you like to start?" Today he ended the call and tossed the phone onto his desk, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. He looked around the room, searching for anything to ground himself. His gaze landed on a framed photo of Ashley and the kids, smiling at the beach. Rage flared, and he grabbed the frame, hurling it against the wall. Glass shattered, fragments scattering across the floor. The dim light of dawn crept in through the window as Michael paced his office, his movements frantic, driven by the storm of emotions within him. His fists clenched and unclenched, his jaw set in a rigid line. Each memory that surfaced felt like a knife cutting deeper. He suddenly stopped, staring at a photograph of their wedding on the wall. He grabbed it, feeling another surge of anger. For what he spat, his voice raw. What was it all for? Without a second thought, he flung the frame across the room, watching it shatter as pieces of glass scattered across the floor. Michael sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The weight of Ashley's betrayal pressed down on him, suffocating. But he couldn't afford to let it paralyze him. He straightened, wiping the sweat from his forehead. There was work to be done. Reaching for his phone, he dialed his lawyer's number. The line rang a few times before a familiar, groggy voice picked up. "Michael," the lawyer asked, sounding confused. "It's barely morning. What?" "I don't have time for small talk," Michael cut in. "Transfer every single property back to my name. All of them. Right now." A pause. "All of them? This could take time, Michael. We'll need paperwork, approvals. Are you sure?" "Do it," Michael said through gritted teeth. "I'll deal with the consequences later." The lawyer hesitated. "All right," he finally agreed. "I'll get started immediately." Michael ended the call and stared at the blank screen, his hands trembling. He clenched them into fists until his knuckles went white. There was no turning back now. He couldn't afford any hesitation. Next, he called the private investigator. The man picked up promptly, his tone sharp and professional. "How can I help you?" "I need DNA tests for my children," Michael said, his voice flat. "Do it discreetly." The investigator paused, sensing the gravity of the request. "Understood. We'll arrange it. When would you like to start?" "Today. Consider it done." Michael hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as exhaustion crept over him. But he wouldn't rest, not until he had the truth in his hands. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cool air stung his skin, but it did little to ease the pain within. The hours dragged on, each second stretching endlessly. Michael paced the room, unable to stay still as he replayed every conversation with Ashley, every moment now tainted. He remembered her tears at their children's births. The laughter they'd shared, all of it now felt like a lie. When the investigator called with the DNA results, Michael's hands shook as he picked up the phone. He didn't need to hear the words to understand the truth, but he listened anyway. "None of the children are biologically yours," the investigator stated in a neutral tone. Michael hung up without replying, standing frozen in the center of the room, staring blankly as if the world had fallen silent. Mechanically, he gathered the birth certificates and placed them on the bed, adding the DNA results on top. With a surprisingly steady hand, he wrote a brief note, "Let's see who belongs to the streets now." He set the note atop the documents, his eyes scanning the room one last time. This had been meant to be their sanctuary, the place where they raised their children and built their dreams. Now it was nothing but a reminder of betrayal. He picked up a small bag, packed a few essentials, and walked to the door, pausing briefly before taking a deep breath and stepping outside, shutting the door gently behind him. He wouldn't look back. As he drove away from the house, everything felt surreal. The streets were empty, the city still wrapped in slumber. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, unsure of his destination but certain he couldn't stay. At dawn, he stopped at a gas station, resting his forehead against the wheel, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Memories flooded his mind: Ashley's smile, the children's laughter, each moment that had felt so real. "Why?" he whispered to himself, closing his eyes to force the memories away. This wasn't the end. He told himself he wouldn't allow it to be. He would rebuild. No matter how long it took, he wouldn't let her win. A knock on the window startled him, and he looked up to see an attendant gesturing for him to move. Michael nodded and started the car. He had a long journey ahead, but would walk it alone if necessary. With one final glance in the rearview mirror, he drove away, beginning a new chapter. It would be painful, but it would be his own, free from betrayal. He was determined to find a way to rise again. Back at the house, the front door creaked open, and Ashley stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The house was dark, an eerie quiet filling the space. She flipped on the light, squinting as her eyes adjusted, sensing something was off. The air felt charged, heavy. She set down her purse and took a step forward, stopping when she noticed documents neatly arranged on the bed. "What the?" she whispered, moving closer. The birth certificates and DNA results lay there, taunting her. Her eyes widened, heart pounding, as she read the note scrawled in Michael's unmistakable handwriting. "Let's see who belongs to the streets now." "No," she breathed, stumbling back, knees weak as she clutched the bed for support. Panic surged, clawing at her throat. She grabbed her phone, dialing Michael's number, but each call went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, her hands trembling. "Come on, pick up," she shouted, her voice breaking. After what felt like forever, she slammed the phone down, a volatile mix of anger and fear overwhelming her. She ran through the house, searching every room, every corner, only to find it empty. "Michael," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls, but silence answered her. She collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening," she whispered, unable to believe it. She had always been in control, always 2 steps ahead. How had it come to this? Hours later, she found herself in a dimly lit bar, nursing a glass of wine she barely tasted, staring into the red liquid as she replayed the events of the last few days. The betrayal she had orchestrated had come full circle. When the door opened and a familiar figure entered, she felt a flicker of hope. "Peter," she whispered, quickly standing as he walked over, a lazy grin on his face. "You look like hell," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Everything's falling apart," she hissed, leaning in close. "Michael knows. He took the properties back. He left." Peter shrugged, swirling his drink. "So he'll be back. Men like him don't know how to be alone. He'll come crawling back." "You don't understand," Ashley snapped, her voice rising. "He disconnected his number. He's gone, Peter. Really gone." Peter leaned back, smirking. "Calm down, you're overreacting. You broke him. He's probably holed up somewhere licking his wounds. He has nowhere else to go." "Stop saying that." Ashley slammed her hand on the table, drawing curious looks from nearby patrons. Lowering her voice, her eyes wild, she said, "He's not coming back. You don't know him like I do." Peter's face darkened. "Then what do you want me to do about it? Chase after him? Beg him to come back?" "I don't know," she cried, tears running down her face again. I didn't think it would turn out like this." Peter rolled his eyes, clearly irritated. "You're making a scene." He leaned in, his voice low and cold. "You knew exactly what you were getting into. Don't act surprised now." For a moment, Ashley stared at him, stunned. She had always believed they were in this together. Now she saw the truth, the emptiness behind his eyes, the indifference in his tone. She had sacrificed her marriage, her family, for this man who didn't care. "You bastard," she whispered, the realization hitting her. Peter chuckled, taking another sip of his drink. "What did you expect? Hearts and flowers?" Grow up. His words crushed her, and she stood abruptly, knocking her glass over. Red wine spilled across the table, pooling around Peter's drink, but she didn't care. She turned and left, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. The next few days were a blur of desperation. Ashley tried everything to track Michael down. She called old friends, visited his office, and even drove past places they had once frequented, but it was as though he had disappeared. One evening, drained and weary, she returned home. The house felt empty, cold, unwelcoming. She collapsed onto the couch, staring at the wall that had once held so many memories. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts, and she rushed to open it, a flicker of hope lighting up before quickly fading. It was her mother. "Ashley," her mother said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You look awful." "Thanks for the support," Ashley muttered, closing the door. Her mother's gaze was sharp, assessing. "So it's true he's gone?" "Yes," Ashley replied, sinking back onto the couch. "He knows everything." Her mother pursed her lips. "You should have been more careful." "Not helpful," Ashley snapped. "Do you have a plan?" her mother pressed, ignoring the outburst. "You can't just sit here and wallow." "I don't know," Ashley shouted, burying her face in her hands. "I have no idea what to do." Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "You've always been too emotional. This is exactly why I told you to handle things quickly and cleanly." Ashley looked up, her eyes blazing. "This was your idea too. You pushed me to marry him, to manipulate him." "And you agreed," her mother retorted, her voice cold as ice. "Don't put the blame on me for your choices." The words lingered in the air, thick and stifling. Ashley turned away, unable to meet her mother's gaze. She had played the game and lost, and now there was no one left to hold accountable but herself. Later that night, Ashley sat alone, staring at the empty bed. Memories of Michael haunted her, the way he used to smile, the way he believed in her. She had shattered that trust, and now she was paying the price. The doorbell rang, startling her. When she opened it, Peter stood there, unshaven and reeking of alcohol. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she said, her tone flat. He stumbled inside without invitation, brushing past her. "I'm here, aren't I? That's got to count for something." "It counts for nothing," she said, slamming the door. Peter let out a hollow laugh. "Look at you, acting all high and mighty. You're nothing without him, and you know it." "Get out," Ashley demanded, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, eyes dark. "Or what?" "Just leave," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the empty house, a harsh reminder of everything she had lost. Ashley sank to the floor, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had played the game and lost. All she had left was silence and the crushing realization that she had ruined everything worth keeping. The air was cold and sharp as Michael stepped out of the small general store nestled at the foot of the mountains. He adjusted the strap on his bag, feeling the weight of his supplies. The solitude of the wilderness had become his refuge, a place where he could shed the pain of betrayal and rediscover himself. His cabin stood deep in the forest, hidden from prying eyes, a sanctuary where he could rebuild. The trail back to the cabin was rough and winding, but Michael walked with purpose. The months had transformed him. The man who once drove luxury cars through crowded streets now found peace in chopping wood and hiking steep trails. His body was leaner, stronger, his mind sharper, more focused. As he reached the clearing, the cabin came into view, a simple structure he'd poured sweat and determination into restoring. Each plank of wood, each nail hammered, was a step toward rebuilding his life. He pushed open the door and set down his supplies, pausing to glance at a photograph of himself taken before the betrayal. He barely recognized that man anymore. Days turned into weeks as he immersed himself in a strict routine: early morning runs through dense woods, strength training with weights made from stones, an hour of reading legal texts and self-help books. Therapy sessions over spotty internet were the hardest. He spoke about the betrayal, about a love that had turned to ashes. His therapist, a calm woman with a gentle voice, urged him to face his pain but not let it define him. "Your anger is valid," Michael, she'd said in one session, "but what do you want to build from it?" After a long silence, he replied, "A life. A better one." "Good," she responded. "Let's work toward that." One morning, while chopping wood, a man from the nearby town approached, his breath visible in the cold air. He held out a newspaper. "Thought you'd want to see this, Id." Michael took it and thanked him. Alone, he unfolded it and scanned the headline. Ashley and Peter's financial downfall was plastered across the front page. The article detailed court battles, debts and liquidations. Ashley, once poised and polished, now looked desperate, her eyes hollow, her face lined with stress. Michael set the paper down, staring into the distance. Despite everything, he felt a strange mix of pity and anger. He picked up the axe and swung it again, letting the physical effort burn through the muddled emotions. As weeks went by, news of Ashley's downfall trickled back to Michael through the few contacts he maintained. She had tried reaching out to old friends, but doors closed in her face, and people whispered about her decline, pleased to see the once proud woman brought low. One evening, as he sipped a cup of coffee by the fire, he received an unexpected email from an old acquaintance, a mutual friend who had stayed neutral. The message was brief: "Ashley and Peter are done. He's left, and she's losing everything. Thought you'd want to know." Michael closed the laptop, his face unreadable. He didn't feel the rush of satisfaction he'd expected. Instead, there was a dull ache, a reminder of what had been lost. He walked outside, the cold wind biting his skin as he gazed up at the stars, the vastness of the night sky making him feel small but, for the first time in a long while, free. Meanwhile, Ashley's world continued to crumble. She sat alone in a nearly empty apartment, the luxury and comfort of her old life a distant memory. Bills piled up on the table, each one a reminder of her mistakes. Peter had walked out weeks ago, taking the last of their money with him. He had laughed when she'd begged him to stay, his words cutting deeper than any wound. "Why would I stay?" he'd sneered, packing his things. "You're nothing without the money, and you know it." "Peter, please," she pleaded, reaching for him. But he brushed her hand aside. "Pathetic," he muttered, slamming the door as he left. Now she was truly alone. She tried reaching out to friends who once flocked to her parties and envied her lifestyle, but they dodged her calls, whispering about her downfall, her betrayal that had backfired. One night, she wandered aimlessly through the city, her shoes worn and her coat too thin for the biting cold. She ended up on a park bench, staring at the lights of the city she had once ruled, tears slipping down her cheeks as, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her choices. Far away in his cabin, Michael stood before the mirror. The man staring back at him was different, not just physically but in every way that mattered. He had been broken, but he had rebuilt himself. He wasn't the man he used to be, the one who'd been deceived and controlled. A knock came at the door, and he opened it cautiously, finding the same man from the nearby town, now with a smile on his face. "There's a gathering tomorrow," the man said. "Thought you might want to come by." "Good food, good people." Michael paused briefly, then nodded. "I'll be there." He shut the door, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. He was ready to move forward, wherever that might lead. The past would always linger, but it no longer defined him. As he got ready for bed, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Ashley and Peter had courted fire and been consumed by it. He, however, had walked through the flames and come out stronger. This was his fresh start. Michael's day began as any other, with the morning sun casting long shadows across the forest floor as he split logs behind his cabin. Each swing of the axe was precise, a measured release of strength, and he welcomed the physical work. It kept his mind clear. Sweat ran down his forehead as he settled into a rhythm. Then a distant car engine interrupted the silence, tires crunching along the gravel path. He froze, gripping the axe tightly. Few ventured this far out without purpose. When the car came into view, his jaw clenched. It was Ashley. She parked at the edge of the clearing, stepped out, and made her way up the path, her shoulders hunched against the cold wind, her frame smaller, her face drawn. Michael watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He set down the axe and wiped his hands on a rag. When she reached the porch, she paused, their eyes meeting in silence, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice unsteady. "Michael," she began, tears gathering in her eyes. "Please, I need to talk to you." He leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. "Talk," then he said, his tone cold and detached. She swallowed, struggling to find the right words. "I know you hate me," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I deserve that, but you have to understand I was wrong, so wrong." His expression didn't shift. "You're right," he replied. "You were." She flinched, as if he had struck her. "I was greedy, blind. I let ambition and my mother's influence twist me into someone I barely recognized." She took a shaky breath. "I thought I could control everything, that I was clever enough to handle it, but I've lost everything. Peter's gone. We're ruined." "Good," he replied simply, turning away. "Please," she cried, stepping closer, "don't turn your back on me." He spun around, his eyes flashing with cold anger. "You have some nerve coming here after everything you and Peter did, after every lie, every manipulation." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know what I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He shook his head, disgust evident. "You're sorry? How convenient. What exactly are you sorry for, Ashley? For cheating? For lying? For using me as a pawn in your little game?" All of it, she sobbed, sinking to her knees. "I was a fool. I thought I was winning, but I lost everything. I lost you. I lost our family. Please, Michael, give me another chance." "Stand up," he commanded, his voice like ice. She remained on the ground, her desperation clear. "Not until you listen to me. I love you, Michael. I always have." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You don't get to say that. You loved what I gave you, the comfort, the properties, the life I built with my own hands. But me? I was just a tool, wasn't I?" "No," she insisted, her voice raw. "It wasn't like that. Wasn't it, he asked, stepping forward, his gaze cutting into her. You and Peter planned every moment of my misery. Every time you looked me in the eye and lied, every time you whispered to him behind my back. Did you really think you could do all that? Come here begging and expect me to care? I'm not expecting anything, she whispered. I have nothing left. You're all I have. That's your problem, he replied coldly. Not mine. Silence settled between them, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. Ashley shivered, the cold biting through her. I know I hurt you more than anyone ever could, she said quietly. But I'm not that person anymore. Change doesn't erase what you did, he replied. It doesn't undo the past. Desperate, she reached out. What do you want me to do? How can I make it right? There is no making it right, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Some things can't be fixed. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. Leave, Ashley. There's nothing for you here. She stared at him, her heart breaking. You really don't care anymore, do you? No, he replied flatly. Not anymore. For a long moment she knelt there, gazing up at him. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. I hope you find peace someday, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I already have, he replied, turning his back on her. She lingered, waiting, hoping he might call her back. But he didn't. Finally, she walked away, each step heavier than the last. When she reached her car, she glanced back one last time, but he was already gone, the cabin door closed. As she drove off, tears spilled down her face, this time not for what she had lost, but for the person she had become. She had played with fire and had been burned beyond recognition. The years passed with a steady inevitability, like the turning of the seasons. The mountains surrounding Michael's cabin transformed, with snow melting into rushing streams in spring, the landscape adorned with vibrant leaves in fall, and winter cloaking the world in white once more. In that place of stillness and change, Michael found the space he needed to heal. Rarely did he think of Ashley or Peter anymore. The memories of his past life were now mere shadows, lacking the power they once held. His days became filled with fresh challenges and simple joys, and his heart, once shattered, had discovered resilience in unexpected places. One crisp autumn morning, Michael attended a community event in the nearby town, a fundraiser for the local school. Tables were laden with homemade goods, children's laughter rang out over games, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. As he strolled through the crowd, content to simply observe, he heard his name. Michael called Angela, a volunteer he'd met at an earlier event. She waved him over with a warm, genuine smile. Surrounded by a bustle of activity, she was helping to organize the gathering, as she often did. Hey, Angela, he said, approaching. Looks like you're running the show, as usual. She laughed, brushing a stray hair from her face. Not by choice, half the volunteers didn't show up. He rolled up his sleeves. Tell me what needs doing. For hours they worked side by side, setting up tables, serving food, and sorting raffle tickets, using a mix of humor and patience to handle any issues. As the sun began to set, Michael found himself smiling more than he had in years. When the last of the guests left, Angela handed him a water bottle as they sat on a nearby bench. Thanks for stepping in, she said, taking a seat beside him. I would have been lost without you. Happy to help, he replied, feeling a flutter of something he hadn't felt in ages. You have a knack for making people feel at home, she teased, taking a sip of her water. He laughed. No, that's your gift. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment the world seemed to quiet. Michael looked away first, unsure yet open to what he was feeling. Angela didn't push, respecting the boundaries he kept, but from that day forward their friendship deepened into something both of them cherished. Over the months, Michael's connection with Angela blossomed, rooted in mutual respect and shared values. She was thoughtful, patient, and fiercely independent, a woman who recognized his scars, yet never tried to erase them, choosing instead to walk beside him as he healed at his own pace. One evening they sat on his cabin porch, gazing up at the stars in a comfortable silence. Angela broke it, her voice gentle. You don't talk about the past much. He nodded, looking into the darkness. Some things are best left behind. I get that, she replied softly, but if you ever want to share, I'm here. Seeing only sincerity in her eyes, he began to open up, speaking of Ashley, the betrayal, and the overwhelming pain he'd endured. Angela listened without interruption, her presence steady and supportive. When he finished, there was no pity in her gaze, only understanding. "You've come so far," she said. "You should be proud." "I'm not sure proud is the word," he replied. "Sometimes surviving doesn't feel worth celebrating." "It does when it brings you here," she said, taking his hand, "to this moment." He squeezed her hand, warmth spreading through him. For the first time he believed he could truly let go, not just push the past aside, but release it entirely. While Michael built a new life, Ashley's world continued to crumble. She moved from one rundown apartment to another, barely making ends meet. Job rejections piled up, each a reminder of her unshakable past. The community she once dominated now looked at her with disdain, and her mother had distanced herself, ashamed of the scandal. One rainy evening, Ashley waited in line at a food bank, clutching her tattered coat tightly. She recognized a few familiar faces, people who had once attended her parties, but they avoided her gaze. She was a shadow of who she'd been, and they preferred not to see her. As she left, a woman bumped into her, knocking her bag of food to the ground. "Watch it," the woman sneered, clearly recognizing her. "Think you're still better than us." Ashley held back tears as she gathered her groceries from the wet ground. "I don't," she whispered. "Not anymore." The woman scoffed and walked off. Alone, Ashley trudged through the rain, her footsteps echoing on the empty streets. Every day was a reminder of the choices that had led her here. She thought often of Michael, of the life they had shared and ultimately destroyed. Regret was her constant companion, but it offered no comfort. Peter, too, faced his reckoning. After abandoning Ashley, he tried to continue his life of manipulation, but his luck had run out. A failed investment left him broke, and he was eventually betrayed by a new lover who'd learned from his own schemes. One night in a dingy bar, he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror behind the counter. The man looking back was worn and defeated. He downed his drink, bitter laughter bubbling up. Karma, he thought, was a relentless hunter. Back in the mountains, Michael and Angela decided to plant a garden together. It was a modest project, but for them it symbolized growth and renewal. Working side by side, Michael felt lighter. One afternoon, as they planted seedlings, Angela paused and looked at him. "Do you believe in second chances?" He considered her question. "I used to think they were for other people," he admitted, "but maybe everyone deserves one." She smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "I think so too." They continued planting, the warmth of the sun on their backs. For Michael, the journey had been long and painful, but it had brought him here, to a fresh start with someone who saw him for who he truly was. The past no longer had a hold on him. He had reclaimed his dignity, found love, and most importantly, learned to trust again. As the wind rustled through the trees, he felt at peace. This was his life now, one built on resilience, strength, and hope. For the first time in years, he was truly happy.